This is the land of our ancestors. Their bones enrich the soil beneath our feet. Their spirits, the sky above. The rivers were their life's blood. Their hearts beat strong with every living thing. This is the land of our ancestors. Fishers, hunters, farmers, builders. Their wisdom, gained through 40,000 seasons, speaks clear to us today. This is the land of our ancestors, land of the Spirit River, land of the Anishinaabe.
In 1873, the Ojibwe people of the Rainy River signed a treaty with the Government of Canada. Under its terms, we agreed to share our land with the newcomers by selecting 7 reserves in our traditional territory along the Rainy River. But our land turned out to be richer than they'd expected. Farmers and loggers arrived, and railroads were built. Demands by the newcomers for more land were constant, and envious eyes were cast on our reserves.
In its simplest terms, the First Nation had 7 reserves selected after treaty. And 6 of those reserves were taken wrongfully or illegally by Canada in 1914 and 1915. And as a result of that, the First Nations had to relocate from those reserves, and they were established at those communities with farms and trading economies, etc., had to relocate from those communities to Manitou Rapids over a very brief period of time.
We have always known that the surrenders taken were wrong, but for over half a century, we had no recourse. Under the Indian Act, it was illegal for a band even to hire a lawyer between 1927 and 1951. Finally, in 1972, the Canadian government established a claims policy, and we could begin the long journey toward reclaiming what had been lost.
Through an illegal process, they managed to secure what they said was a consent to the surrender of this land. If you looked at it internally, you found that the communities, in fact, didn't consent. They just managed to get enough numbers from the collective whole. So the surrenders were taken in April 1914.
The day we got Rod involved here, I think that that was the best move we made. And he understands where we're coming from. He understands what we're feeling about, what it is that's value. And when you look at value, it's not monetary value, it's the cultural value, the values of that community, where it's going. And I think we realize that we're changing. We've made change 30 years ago when we decided we want to do things on our own. And I think that that change is paid off.
Canada announced its first claims policy in 1972. In the mid-1970s, the Grand Council of Treaty 3 set up its Treaty and Aboriginal Rights Research Centre. And Rainy River proposed that they undertake research of the surrender claim. So the historical research was undertaken through the mid to late 80s. 1982, Canada announced another claims policy, and the fall of 1982, Rainy River actually submitted this claim.
The Government of Ontario agreed to negotiate in 1987 on condition that Canada take part as well. Canada refused, so the Rainy River First Nations sued both governments in 1989. The federal government finally joined the negotiations in 1994. The 3 parties signed a negotiation framework agreement in 1997 and reached a general consensus on the claim value in December 2001. A final consensus on claim value should be reached early in 2003, after which the legal agreement will be finalized and a vote called.
This is an exciting time for us. It's time for us to be involved, and this is not a time to sit back and let the bureaucrats run the show. Like I said before, we are the ones that are in the forefront on this, and it's up to us, First Nations people, to say, hey, this is our time, and this is how it's going to go.
In negotiations, we were able to establish a number of important principles. We expect the return of the full amount of land originally taken in 1914 and 1915, equal to 46,326 acres, and that all this land will be set apart as reserve. We have a right to financial compensation for being unable to use our land for almost 90 years. And we have a right to compensation for the improvements we'd already made to our reserves before 1914 and the cost of reestablishing those improvements at Manitou Rapids. The package we're negotiating is based on these principles. It's important to note that the signing of the settlement agreement will have no effect on any treaty or Aboriginal rights of the First Nation. This negotiation only deals with compensation to the Rainy River First Nations for the wrongful taking of our reserves.
Of course, we would have wanted different things. Of course, we would have wanted some of our original homelands back. But the fact of the matter is that there are people living on that land now who had nothing to do with what happened. And also because our elders told us to negotiate and also to come up with something that's not only good for your community and our children, but also for the people who live in the surrounding communities, ostensibly our neighbors.
The governments have agreed that the 46,326 acres surrendered must be replaced. We have agreed that there will be no expropriation of land bought in good faith by our neighbors, which includes virtually all the area of the 6 former reserves. Under the agreement, approximately 1/3 of our land will be replaced with Crown land provided by the government. The remainder will come from private land. The First Nation will buy this land from willing sellers over time, using a trust fund established for that purpose.
And the Crown land areas that we've come down to in the selection process are set out in blue here. The Hay Bay area is intended to be a hunting area, the equivalent of the original wildland reserve. It's expected to be maintained that way forever. This is a traditional use area of the community. There's still, every fall, ricing happens here and hunting in this area. The second area we looked at was Gates Ajar, which is a cultural site. There's a traditional camping and pipestone gathering area here. Again, it's not residential development. That's a cultural site to begin with. And the third larger area that we're looking at is an area around the Sveen Lake, which is the north end of Rainy Lake here. This area is roughly about, I'd say about 3,000 acres, something like that. This one's about 820, and this one's about 9,100 acres. We've chosen some small tracts immediately surrounding the present-day community of Manitou Rapids. We felt it was important to choose it because it would lend itself to us enlarging our present community in the future, giving it some sense of continuity. And then, of course, we chose some of the islands on Rainy River as a matter of principle, and also to show and demonstrate our presence on this river for hundreds and hundreds of years, and to make sure that that is maintained into the future.
The keepers of the land is understanding the land. We know what's there. Like right now where I live, I got a lot of medicines outside. I have to take care of that because it's my duty.
The land is a vital part of this agreement, but it's not the only part. The governments have agreed to compensate us for the income we lost as a community by not having the opportunity to use our original reserve since 1915, plus the cost of community buildings, fences, and other improvements we'd already made to the land before the surrender. The dollar value we've attached to all these categories, which took 8 years to estimate, is based on the advice of some of the very best people in the business.
We hired the best people we could to provide us, the First Nation, with advice on the reasonableness of these kinds of assessments. So we put our team together well and produced the best result that we could now.
At the present stage of negotiations, it appears that the total settlement value, including the value of the Crown land to be provided by Ontario and financial compensation, will come to around $71 million. After setting aside funds for private land purchase, reserve creation, and the cost of negotiations, the remaining money, which should amount to $50 million or more, will be used for the community's benefit, as decided by Rainy River First Nations members, both on and off reserve.
What Council is intending to do, and it has to get feedback from the membership as well, is set the compensation funds up in a trust that's managed by on and off reserve members. The settlement is not a new truck, a new car, a new set of furniture for your house. It's community benefits, long-term things like legal rights, education, housing, incentives, business development, that type of thing. That's why the community is intent on maintaining the capital in trust and using the revenue from the trust funds to deal with these other special initiatives by the community, because it'll earn several $1 million a year.
These funds represent a tremendous opportunity for our people, who have already accomplished so much. In fact, our businesses make us the 4th largest employer in the region.
We want to do our own thing. I think the community has demonstrated economically, from the limited resources it has demonstrated it can be a thriving community. It has the economic base, it has quite a number of ventures that it's in right now.
Well, we have a sawmill. It's a fully modern sawmill. It's fully computerized. There's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 guys working there. We have a window factory, make our own windows. We have a fish hatchery. And we have a large historical complex several miles west of the community.
I look forward to working together with the First Nations people to get this thing going. And there are a lot of benefits to this because often what's good for First Nations there on the Manitou, it's certainly good for the rest of our municipality as well.
We want to keep pride. We want to see Anishinaabe people here 100 years from now, 200 years from now, who can speak the language, who can still practice their culture. I think that's what's important. The monetary values that we may gain from this claim is only going to allow us to be able to plan for those.
It's an exciting time, but also one that imposes a great responsibility on each one of us. The next critical step in the process is a vote on the agreement. Every person on the membership list, 18 years of age and over, will be entitled to vote once the negotiating team can confirm a final compensation package and legal agreement. But nothing will happen unless a majority of eligible members vote on the proposed agreement. And a majority of those voting have to vote in favor for any of this to become reality.
The whole deal, I think, is going to be a good deal for the First Nations. But along with that, like I say, is there needs to be planning, there needs to be preparation, and there needs to be education, and there needs to be consultation with the community members.
Over the last 3 decades, the negotiating team has worked hard to be worthy of the great heritage our ancestors left us. To honor their effort, and to secure all our futures, it's our duty to consider this agreement, discuss it, and then vote.
You're not doing this for yourself. You know, so don't get an agreement that you think is going to just be good for you, because that's not good enough. You have to get an agreement that you think, based on your best abilities, is going to be good for kids, your descendants that aren't even born yet. That's the way you have to look at it. This is Chief Al Hunter. After 11 years, the negotiators have reached a consensus. Our goal is to keep you fully informed about the settlement and referendum. That's what this program is about.
In the spring of 2003, all members of the Rainy River First Nations were sent the video entitled Rainy River First Nations Surrender Claim, Negotiation of a Settlement. Now that the negotiating teams have initialed the final draft agreement for the review and approval of Canada, Ontario, and the First Nations, a second video has been prepared to assist the members of the First Nations in understanding the final terms of the agreement. Later this year, all eligible members will be asked to vote on whether they accept the terms of the settlement agreement. For the convenience of members, and in case any member did not receive the first video for some reason, the first video is included in this presentation. In 1873, the Ojibwe people of the Rainy River signed Treaty 3. Under its terms, we agreed to share our land by selecting 7 reserves in our traditional territory along the Rainy River. In 1914 and 1915, 6 of those 7 reserves were taken wrongfully or illegally by Canada. As a result of that action, called a surrender by the government, those First Nations had to relocate to Manitou Rapids.
In 1982, the First Nation first submitted its claim to Canada and Ontario, alleging that the surrender was illegal. The land was wrongfully taken from the First Nation. From 82 to 1987, there was pretty intensive research by both governments. And in January of 1987, it was Attorney General Ian Scott accepted the responsibility on behalf of Ontario for their role in the taking of the land, but they did so conditional upon Canada's participation. And it wasn't until 1994, actually 7 years later, that Canada accepted the claim for negotiation. And it was then that the negotiations began. For the next 5 years or so, we spent time doing studies of the land value and economic loss related to the taking of the land. And it was December of 2001 that we reached a consensus on the financial terms of settlement. We've been working on the legal agreement since then.
This program is an overview of the terms of the agreement, on which you'll soon be asked to vote. The key terms deal with the replacement of the land taken and related financial compensation. Canada and Ontario have agreed that all acres surrendered must be replaced. We have agreed that there will be no expropriation of land bought in good faith by our neighbors, which includes virtually all the area of the 6 former reserves. Under the agreement, approximately 1/3 of our land, 14,945 acres, will be replaced with Crown land provided by Ontario and set aside as reserve. We selected land in our traditional use area at Hay Bay to replace our hunting grounds. At Gates Ajar, as the area is a source of pipestone and so has cultural significance. Sveen Lake, at the north end of Rainy Lake, which is a cultural retreat and teaching area, and several islands in the Rainy River, which will affirm our historical presence and our role as guardians. The process of converting Crown land to reserve will take 2 to 3 years after the final agreement is signed. The remainder of the land will be purchased from private owners. The First Nation will buy this land from willing sellers over a period of 40 years, using a trust fund established for that purpose. This land need not be contiguous with any existing reserve land of the Rainy River First Nation, but will be sought within the purchase area indicated. The average time to convert privately held land to reserve status is also up to 3 years.
In terms of financial compensation, the first thing we looked at was economic loss. It means the lost opportunity to use the reserve land for things like forestry, agriculture, tourism, recreation, mineral extraction, types of economic activities the community would have been involved in. The studies we did of that economic activity took us several years to complete. And once it was completed, we had to bring it into a current value. And we reached an agreement on that current value in December of 2001. Secondly, we looked at the cost of relocation and reestablishment of the community from 4 or 5 locations to the one community, Manitou Rapids, and that included things like housing and fencing and grading and improvements and gardens and things like that. And to the extent that there was any shortfall in the reestablishment of the community, the First Nation was to receive compensation for that. Finally, Canada Ontario received a credit for the amount of money that had been paid to the First Nation for the sale of their land after the taking.
The total value of the settlement will be $71,198,160, inclusive of the repayment of the negotiating loans of $2,196,945 and the final legal costs of $1.25 million. After subtracting the negotiating loans and final legal costs, the total compensation is then $67,751,215, split roughly equally between the 2 levels of government. The First Nation will then credit Ontario $3,969,000 for the value of the 14,945 acres of crowned land selected. So the final amount to be paid to the Rainy River First Nation for the settlement will be $63,782,215. Each party will deposit their portion into a legal trust controlled by the First Nation within 45 days of signing the final agreement. Upon receipt of the full amounts, the First Nation will discontinue its lawsuit. The final compensation will be allocated for 2 general purposes. First, the implementation funds will be used for buying private land from willing sellers and the costs related to those purchases. $15 million will be set aside for this purpose, broken down as follows. Land purchase, $10 million. The cost of land purchase, $1 million. Municipal tax adjustment and holding costs, $500,000. And administration costs, $3.5 million. The First Nation will not pay GST. The remaining money, a total of $48,782,215, will be used for community purposes, that is, for the community's benefit, as decided by Rainy River First Nation members, both on and off reserve. Council will establish and staff a claim implementation office for the purpose of identifying land to be purchased from willing private sellers using money allocated for implementation purposes. A 3-member subcommittee of Council will oversee the operation of this office and approve proposed land purchases recommended by the Claims Implementation Office Manager. This subcommittee will consist of 1 councillor and 2 members, 1 living on reserve and 1 off reserve. The $48,782,215 earmarked for community purposes will be administered by 2 groups of trustees. Both these groups will be chosen by a committee of community members with suitable input from Council. The first group of 7 trustees will be responsible for financial administration of all trust funds, that is, the amount that is initially received from the settlement and all investment income. This group will consist of both on and off reserve members and at least 2 professionals, such as a lawyer, accountant, or financial advisor. The actual investment of the funds in the trust will be handled by 1 or more independent financial management firms. The second group of 5 trustees, made up of 3 on-reserve and 2 off-reserve members, will define and determine community purposes projects and programs. It's expected that all community purpose activities will be funded by investment income only. Guidance from Council will be limited to the areas of administration and community planning. Projects over $75,000 must be approved by Council, and projects over $250,000 by the members of the First Nation. The settlement of the surrender claim will finally resolve a century-old wrong. The trust money, managed by the trustees, will remain as a permanent legacy for the Rainy River First Nation, providing unlimited opportunities for our members. Except for the release of all claims related to the 1914-1915 surrender and the confirmation of an absolute surrender of the land claim, this settlement agreement will have no effect on treaty and Aboriginal rights and no effect on Rainy River First Nation entitlement to any programs and funding offered by the Government of Canada. When the vote on this proposed settlement is called, it will take place under the Indian Act referendum regulations, supervised by Indian Affairs. The process will take about 3 months from first notice to completion. After the date of the vote is announced, all members, both on and off reserve, will be sent an information package, including the final claim settlement agreement, the trust agreement, explanations, maps, and other supporting material to ensure you are fully informed. Informational meetings will be held in different locations as needed. Various poll locations will be set up on voting day. Advance voting will be permitted. All members on the band list who are 18 years of age and over will be eligible to vote.
This settlement is about our future and our children's future. If you have any questions at all before the referendum, please do not hesitate to contact me. Miigwech.